Hi, welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Stephanie Wagner. I'm a clinical psychologist here at the NYU Child Study Center, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about some areas that I specialize in. So I'm one of the co-directors of our early childhood service, and that service sees kids 5 and under. And I'm also the director of our Parent-Child Interaction Therapy program, which is a research-supported treatment for young children with disruptive behavior problems. So I really enjoy working with challenging behavior, and I'm here today to share some tips and information with you. So I'm really looking forward to the content. I also want to remind you that you can submit questions at any time today by typing them into your questions pane of the control panel. That's on the right side of your screen. We will answer any questions at the end of our presentation. So today's webinar came about because there's been some recent controversy and debate over timeout. Some of that's been widely publicized. And I really want to examine that with you and help you see it through a lens of both science and clinical tips so that you can make some really good decisions about whether or not to use punishment and how to use it with your child. So to do this, we're going to discuss a number of things. One thing we're going to talk about is how young children learn and why certain behavioral strategies are recommended with young children. We will also discuss, through a lens of research, facts and myths about timeout and kind of how you should be thinking about this procedure and how you should be thinking about the debate. And lastly, I want to leave you with some practical hands-on guidance for what to do with those challenging behaviors that you experience and that every parent experiences with young children. So to start off, I wanted to kind of frame some of the controversy and debate around timeout. So timeout that's been recommended by experts in child development, experts in working with kids with social emotional problems for many decades. It's endorsed by many organizations, including the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Psychological Association. So parents frequently come to me with questions and concerns when discussing it. They've tried it, it doesn't work. They're not sure it's the right approach for their child. They think it might make things worse. And so I wanted to give a webinar today to discuss this more. In addition to parents having concerns about this procedure, there's been some recent public criticism. One of the most notable examples of this was in Time magazine. They had an article that entitled "Timeouts Are Hurting Your Child." And this was based on inputs from some prominent figures, a psychiatrist that works with children, Dr. Siegel, and a therapist, Dr. Bryson. And the way the article was framed was that timeouts really have negative effects on kids, that it interferes with the children's brain connections and healthy activity in children's brain, that it deprives children of their profound need for connection in a way because it isolates children, and it actually is counterproductive because it makes behavior problems worse. And this article came out about 2 years ago. Since that time, some of the statements and claims made in that article were corrected. In fact, Dr. Siegel has a blog about it where he says, you know, some of this was slanted the wrong way in the article. I'm not against timeout, I'm against the improper use of timeout. Yet even though there's been some corrections by many sources, this controversy really still continues. So to take a step back from the controversy, I really wanted to start off by telling you some more things about how young children learn and why it's important to teach them. And one of the first important points is that children don't have anything innate built in that tells them right from wrong. Morals are really socialized based on parent and societal values and how the right way to raise a kid. So this is something that needs to be taught, and it needs to be taught in children starting from a young age. The other piece that's really important to think about is that their children learn 2 ways. They learn, one, from the consequences that happen to them. So consequences that happen to them that are positive from their point of view are going to increase behaviors and increase the things that they're doing. And consequences that they don't like are going to decrease behaviors. And they also learn from watching others and seeing what other people do and what the responses are from them. And you probably, if you have young kids, have all noticed times where they imitate you, or they seem to know everything to do with a phone from a really young age, or they like to pretend to clean or do things that adults do because they really soak up things that adults and parents do. The other important point is, given this, parents have a lot of responsibilities for teaching right from wrong. Not only do they have to kind of show appropriate behavior, because kids imitate and pick up on all the things parents do, they also have to provide a safe and loving environment at a young age when children do not know right from wrong. And then they have to spend a lot of time teaching rules and explaining the rules. And when children test the rules, then they have to begin setting and enforcing limits. And so that all starts from a young age, and starting to enforce limits will happen between age 1 and 2. So that puts a lot of pressure on parents to really be in touch and really know how to do that in an effective way. So I was talking a little bit about consequences and consequences that young children experience. And attention is one of the most powerful consequences that children respond to, especially young children. So young children really look up to adults. Adults are the biggest thing in their world. And so the adult attention is really rewarding to almost all children. And it is really powerful with young children because for them, parents are much bigger than school age or teen kids, where the social group becomes more peer-based. There are different types of attention, and all things about attention are not equal. So many people think that, positive attention, yes, that's a good thing, and it's true. Positive attention, whether that be verbal in terms of giving positive feedback or just spending time with your child, or rewards or privileges, that does serve to increase the relationship and increase bonding and really create a warm culture. And it can, if it's done strategically, change behaviors. So other important point about attention is negative attention isn't always negative to children, and especially kids that are spirited and strong-willed and opinionated, they're going to prefer negative attention over no attention. And that's why a lot of parents will say, I just can't have a phone conversation with my child interrupting constantly, even if I tell them not to, or tell them I'm busy, or to do something else, even if I'm reprimanding them. And that's because they'd rather have that kind of negative attention and some sort of interaction than no interaction. And those are kind of common things for young children. The other really important thing to think about when you think about attention is that for kids, especially children that are strong-willed, stubborn, opinionated, spirited kids, that the magnitude and the size of the attention is important. And they're going to really crave interesting attention, stimulating and novel attention. And this becomes really relevant when we start talking about timeout, because for timeout, if you're chasing your child to get them in timeout, or, it becomes a off the chair or off the step, on the step game, that can become very fun and very stimulating to young kids. All right. So now that we talked a little bit about consequences and a tad about attention, I wanted to talk about changing behavior, because the whole reason parents consider punishment or parents consider timeout is because there's some behaviors they want to change in their child, and they want to teach them other ways of responding or stop them from doing something. So when thinking about changing behavior, one key point is that most behaviors can be significantly changed without touching a punishment procedure. And that would be through a couple of different types of positive parenting practices. And behaviors that tend to respond especially well to this are things like whining, playing roughly, interrupting, some of the common things kids do, using too loud of a voice inside. Those can be changed really nicely by just having a really good positive behavior management plan with your child. And the two main things to keep in mind when thinking about positive behavior management strategies are the concepts of positive reinforcement and differential attention. Positive reinforcement really is just anything that encourages a behavior and that the child likes, and that's going to increase the behavior. And when we think of that, we think of things like praise, that's good job, high fives, pats on the back, telling them specifically what you like, nice job using your big girl voice, or nice job using your big boy voice. Rewards, many parents use rewards with kids for developmental tasks like toilet training, so maybe a sticker chart, maybe M&Ms. Those would be examples of rewards. And then there's also privileges. Privileges tend to be better with older kids because privileges often involve something you have to wait for. And for kids 5 and under, waiting is really hard. So kind of consequences and positive consequences that are more immediate are typically more effective. The other piece about positive strategies that I really want to highlight is that positive strategies are really critical for teaching skills. And if you've cheered on your child as they're learning to walk, but their legs are a little wobbly, or if you've used some good job or great job, practicing peeing in the potty or any of those things, you probably use some sort of positive strategy to encourage developmental skills. Well, learning how to behave appropriately is also a skill, so learning how to accept adult limits or listen to adults. And positive strategies are really key here as well. The last point I want to make about positive strategies is that there's this concept of differential attention because kids love and soak up adult attention, and because they can respond to both positive and negative attention. Differential attention is showing the difference in how you're responding to your child based on whether the behavior is neutral or positive, or based on whether it's more of a misbehavior. And being able to give a lot more attention and a lot more warmth and a lot more intense reactions to neutral and positive behavior, and then minimizing how much you react to mild misbehavior and really staying calm and avoiding interesting looks, raising your voice, and a lot of those things can be so helpful in really changing behavior in a positive way without having to go to punishment. Now, that being said, you can change a lot of behaviors with positive strategies alone, but there are some behaviors that are not going to respond to just positives. And there are some behaviors that are more severe and typically require the use of a punishment strategy to help teach right from wrong and get your child on a better track. And behaviors that typically fall into this realm include children that frequently disobey adult instructions and seem to not listen, even, such as say no before they're even told what to do, and for things that can be safety concerns. So that would be aggression, destructive behavior. So throwing things, knocking things over, hitting, kicking. Those are behaviors that typically may need a punishment down the line. Now, addressing these behaviors are really important, and even though some of these behaviors are common in young children. So kids, especially children under age 3, tantrums and some physical aggression and wanting to do things their way are really common. However, these can get in the way of their functioning, and if they're doing it at a more intense level than other children or a more frequent level than other children, it can be a red flag for that this is going to go on beyond early childhood. And these behaviors are much easier to treat if you're treating them and dealing with them at a young age. Now, when considering punishment and when deciding to do punishment, it's so important that before you even start timeout, loss of privilege, any punishment, that you're starting with the positive strategies first, because that's really critical for them using some new skills and learning skills. The next piece is that the punishment strategies that are based on research are timeout and loss of privileges. Now, loss of privileges tends to be a little better with older children. So I have a lot of parents of young children that will tell me, when they act up or when they hit, I take away a toy and they're upset, but then they just start playing with something else. And that's pretty common with young children. So the timeout tends to be more effective if it's done in an effective way. So to get into a little bit about timeout and a little bit about, what you need to consider to make it effective, I wanted to go over really what timeout is. And unfortunately, when we talk about timeout, we're really shortening it to a point where people aren't necessarily thinking about it the right way. So timeout is actually short and an abbreviation for timeout from positive reinforcement. And this is really important because this gives you information about how and why it's going to work. So basically, this means that it's a brief break from fun and rewarding parts of the environment. You can kind of think of, like, if this was a hockey game, this would be a player in the penalty box, and they're not getting to play the game, they're not getting any attention, they're seeing everyone else have fun, but they're not able to have fun themselves, and no one's really responding to them. So basically, based on the definition, some things are required in order for timeout to work in an effective way. One thing is that the environment before timeout and after timeout needs to be fun, it needs to be stimulating, it needs to be full of attention, warmth, and positivity, and that's usually referred to as time in. And we have a saying at the summer program that I work with that timeout's not so bad if time in isn't so good. And I think that's really important because the time in is what's going to make timeout work. The next thing that is so essential is that timeout needs to really be boring and monotonous if it's a break from the fun. So if there are things like negotiating the time in timeout or negotiating another chance or holding your child to make them stay in timeout, all of those things are going to take away from the effectiveness of it working and maybe really stimulating and actually really rewarding for your child, even though it's not an enjoyable experience at the time. So before we talk about what makes a good timeout procedure, I did want to go a little bit into some of the concerns that have come up and some of the misconceptions about timeout following the article in Time magazine. So the three big ones are timeout interferes with attachment, timeout hurts your child, and then that timeout doesn't change behaviors. And I'm going to go through them one by one to give you some information before I give you some tips. So the first piece, timeout interferes with attachment. And really this myth says that, if you're using a timeout procedure, that's going to disrupt that healthy emotional bond that parents and children need, and that's going to disrupt that connection. When you actually look at the facts, research has looked at kids with different types of attachment and looked at what their parenting styles are like in those parents. And the research really shows that children with secure attachment, that is the best attachment because those are kids that know their parents there, they feel dependent upon, their parents reliable, that the kids with secure attachment, their parents can also set some limits, and that their parents tend to be also warm, and they can set and enforce limits. And these are kids that can explore on their own and then can also, feel like they have a reliable parent. Now, effective timeout doesn't disrupt this bond for a good handful of reasons. One is parents don't leave during a timeout. It's not like parents are going off and their child thinks they're not going to come back and they're not threatening to leave. That they're right there. They're just not giving attention and anything that's reinforcing at the moment. The next piece that's really important is that timeout is brief. And after a brief timeout, there's a chance to repair a relationship. And all relationships have some level of conflict, some level of disagreement. And it's not about whether or not there is conflict or disagreement. It's about how you repair and the warmth overall. And after brief timeouts, there's a chance to kind of reconnect. And that's essential also for timeout working. The second myth I wanted to discuss is that timeout hurts your child. And this was based on the way things were presented in this article saying that, hey, there's brain imaging research that shows similar patterns of activity in the brain when children are emotionally distressed because they're being punished or in timeout, and similar brain activity when they are physically hurt. So timeout is really harmful to children. Now, when we take a look at the facts, unfortunately, the research was a little bit mispresented in this article because the research that looked at emotional pain and brain activity actually shows that adults who were experiencing social rejection had similar brain patterns. So the situation was completely different in adults that were being rejected by peers, and it was looking at adults, not children. So unfortunately, there hasn't been any research looking at that in children. I would also argue that timeout is really helpful for a number of reasons. One is, if timeout is done correctly, it's showing children that their parents are using a calm and a predictable approach to dealing with conflicts. It also gives them a chance during that break to learn and practice the skill of regulating their behavior and regulating their emotions while they have this warm, loving relationship, but giving them a chance to practice these really valuable skills. And it's also been supported by a lot of research by a number of different researchers that have really found positive benefits and also found positive effects on the parent-child relationship and positive effects in reducing risk for kind of overly harsh discipline. So it really, is helpful, and it's not just that it's not hurtful. The last myth I'm going to go over is the idea that timeout does not change behaviors and it's counterproductive because it makes behaviors actually worse. Now, the truth of this is the behavior can get worse initially when parents start using a timeout procedure. We call this the extinction burst, and that basically means the parent is doing something new, the child isn't used to this response, and they're testing out all the things they used to do to get out of a situation or have it end differently. You can kind of think of this as going to a vending machine and nothing comes out, and then you press it again and you press it again, and maybe you shake the machine a little bit, and eventually you give up if it doesn't work. And children, when things change on them, they will try out different responses initially, and then that will subside over time. The truth also is that ineffective timeout can worsen the behavior, especially if parents try timeout but then stop it when the child's behavior intensifies because you don't see through that extinction burst. The next thing is timeout doesn't really teach skills, but it suppresses the behavior. So that's why it's so important that parents use some of the positive strategies I mentioned earlier to really teach and encourage new skills. And that those should be in place before timeout is even started. The next piece that's important is that timeout has to be done in a consistent, strategic way over time so that the behavior may not change in the moment and it may not change the next day, but that it really takes practicing it the same way over time. So now I'm going to give you a couple tips in case you are using a timeout and would like to make it more effective or considering starting one with your young child. So one thing that's just so critical is that you're not making decisions about using timeout in the moment when you're frustrated or you don't know what to do with your child. That you're thinking about, okay, we have this problem. We have some problem with hitting, or we have this problem with obeying me, and I'm going to make the choice to do that proactively and come up with a game plan and know what I'm going to do. So you're going into it kind of knowing the set of steps you're going to take. The next piece that's so important is that you're not going to be using it for every single behavior, and you're really going to prioritize a couple of the big ones to start. So you're going to be really clear on, these are the behaviors that I would want to target and I would consider using timeout for. The next piece that's so important, and I mentioned it a bit earlier in the talk, is that really having some positive strategies in place before you get to starting timeout. And one of the ways we like to do this is focusing on the behavior that you want to decrease, or the negative behavior's positive opposite. So say you want to start a timeout for hitting. Well, that means that you should also be praising and rewarding when you see your child use gentle touches, keep their hands to themselves, use their words when they're upset. So you're able to praise the opposite and the skills that you want to bring up. And you could be doing that through praise or rewards or both. You also want to select a really good timeout location, and that timeout location should be away from anything stimulating, because again, timeout needs to be boring to work, so it can't be like their siblings watching cartoons and they can see the TV. The rooms are generally not good because they have a lot of toys and a lot of things kids can get into. And it also is important for parents to be able to monitor their children in timeout. So that tends to make a good timeout location. I personally like chairs and mats because young kids have trouble with boundaries. So if you just say it's over there in that corner or against that wall, kids can kind of wander, but something like the boundaries of a chair or a mat can help with that. I also recommend that you setting a length of time that timeout's going to last in advance. It doesn't have to be long to be effective, especially for kids that are active, that are impulsive, that have trouble kind of staying in one place. Smaller is better. Starting with like 2 minutes, even if your child's 4 or 5, there's no reason that it needs to be a minute per age. And starting with a briefer amount of time can be helpful, especially for a kid that's not used to it. In general, for kids 5 and under, it should be no longer than several minutes. The next thing, to think about when starting an effective timeout procedure is reviewing it with your child at a time they're calm and telling them, I'm trying to work with you and teach you other ways of dealing with things other than hitting. We're going to start using timeout when you do it to help you remember, and really framing it as a way to help them. You can role play it with them. You can model it with using dolls and stuffed animals to show them when it's going to happen and what it's going to look like. Another thing that's helpful to prepare our children is whenever you see the behavior that you want to target, so hitting, for the first few days, you just label it. You say, you know what, you just hit, soon that's going to be a timeout. That helps them kind of get in the mindset, and it doesn't catch them completely by surprise. The other thing that's critical is timeout has to occur right after the behavior for the child to link it and to really learn from it. So something happens in the morning, you're rushed getting out the door, you should not give a timeout when they get home from school for something that happened in the morning. The next point that is really important is that you want to use that timeout consistently every time you see that behavior, and you also want to avoid using it kind of on the fly or just on the spot because something else is frustrating. You really want to work on the specific behavior that you're trying to deal with and think carefully before starting using it for other behaviors, because that's going to be the way that your child's behavior can actually change over time. This is just so critical. The calmer you are, the better it will go. So if your child tends to push your buttons and there's certain things that are really tough, trying to take a deep breath, prepare yourself, the calmer you stay, the more you're modeling that for your child. The next piece is that when your child is in timeout, really not avoiding giving any attention, answering questions about how much time is left, and talking to them about what they did was wrong. Anything, you really have to avoid verbal and nonverbal attention, trying to keep your best poker face. And also letting your child out once they're calm, and then looking for opportunities to get back to time in and back to the positive attention is also really key. So just a couple, and I'm going to put these up quick so we can get to questions, but there are a couple signs that you may need to consider getting more help. So if you are frequently feeling frustrated, angry, annoyed at your child, just doing timeout alone may not help. You might need to seek out more help. If you feel like you need to stay calm, you've tried a couple things on your own, but it's so hard to do, that would be another area. Also, caregivers can differ on whether or not to use punishment and how. That is another area that can be very confusing to kids and a sign that you may need more help. And if you've tried timeout and your child refuses to go or refuses to stay, young kids, you can escort them, but if you feel like they're flopping on the ground and pretending to be dead, or you feel like you're dragging them, you don't want to do anything unsafe, and that can be another way that you might want to consult more help. And if you're giving many timeouts a day and you don't see a change in behavior, that's another sign that there's something that's not quite working here, and it would be a good time to consult. I'm just going to put up a couple resources before I open it up for questions. So we have an early childhood clinical service here, and we provide consultations and treatment if young children and families are interested, and parents that have questions can come in for just a parent consultation. We also provide parent-child interaction therapy, and that's for kids that have significant problems with disruptive behavior they're functioning, and this is a great treatment that gives parents help in the moment, and a therapist is able to coach them through some difficult situations in the moment. Some books that I like that have a lot of the strategies I talked about and go into more detail are The Incredible Years, Parenting the Strong-Willed Child, and SOS Help for Parents. So hopefully that information is helpful for you. I'm going to now open it up for some questions. All right, so the first question is, how do you effectively implement immediate timeouts while out of the house? This is a great question because public behavior can be one of the most challenging arenas for parents when they want something in the store or they don't get their way or they have to leave. A couple things. One is you do not want to start with a public timeout. You want to make sure your child is able to serve timeout at home and that you have that skill down, because being able to serve timeout or take a brief break is a skill, and so you can't do that in public if you haven't learned to do it at home. For kids that are able to serve timeout at home and parents that are able to use it effectively there, you can do it in public. Basically, you need to kind of make a plan in advance of, oop, we're going to the store, and we would do timeout right outside the store, or we're going to the park, and if something comes up at the park, here's a bench. Some parents will bring a mat or kind of something like a placemat they can roll up in their bag that kind of gives the boundary. But again, you wouldn't start with timeout in public. All right, the next question. If you have more than one child misbehaving at the same time, would you recommend timeouts for both kids at the same time and setting? So I would recommend that if you are using any sort of house rules, that it applies to both children, especially if they're close in age, because otherwise it tends to get unfair. So I would recommend using timeout with both children, but I wouldn't recommend introducing timeout with both kids at the same time. I'd recommend kind of working with introducing it with them both individually, and then having them practice it and role play and go over timeout. And then when you get to the point where you need to put both children in timeout, just again, having a plan for like, all right, if we have 2 timeouts going and we're in this room, one timeout could be here and one could be there, or one's going to be in the hallway and one's going to be in this room. And I know people in Manhattan have kind of smaller spaces, but I do recommend that it would be immediate and that both children have a timeout, and then just thinking through the logistics of where to do it and how to monitor. All right, this is going to be our last question. If a child should have disciplinary action safety issues, but it didn't start during a fun, warm time in time, then what? So this is a good question. So first of all, that is going to come up sometimes because, maybe they're getting ready for bed and that's not a fun time in time, but, they do something that breaks a rule. If you've already introduced timeout as a rule, you're going to still enforce it. Now, that doesn't mean that, that it's not going to work. That just means that, you need to use the timeout. But then even if returning them from timeout, you're like, oh, we're going to have to go back to really boring things they don't want to do, then you need to use your attention really strategically to say, to provide warmth and provide positive attention, even if the activity isn't so fun. But that again gets a little bit more challenging, and those can be times where pairing that with loss of privilege or rewards can be helpful for some kids. All right, so I am going to wrap up. So on behalf of the Child Study Center, thank you for joining me today. Once you leave the webinar, you will receive a survey, and we would really appreciate it if you complete it. You will also receive a follow-up email within a day or two with a link to today's recording. We also hope you can join us for our next webinar, Parents, Relationships, and Breakups. That's on November 1st at 1 p.m. Thanks again. Bye.